is Prayag. I am currently a third year student of BCom Honors. Today I am here to present on my topic Sustainable Finance for Net Zero, Circular Economy and Sustainable Living. Thank you all for the opportunity and my heartfelt gratitude to my co-authors Dr. Sriram sir and Dr. Radhalakshmi ma'am. What motivated me to take this research? So when you talk about energy or industry, right, capital reallocation is a very integral component of your net zero commitments. Given that the framework for sustainable finance, it is in the development. However, it is far from not being fragmented. Can it deliver structural recarbonization? Recarbonization is what plagues the concept of sustainable finance. Because right now sustainable finance is being seen as a symbolic compliance rather than as a structural decarbonization catalyst. There is a critical minerals paradox. That is, you talk about decarbonization technology. What we don't realize is it requires more extraction and more resources rather than less. The research we have is that you have several existing studies that in isolation, they elaborate about mining, portfolio alignment, and etc. I'm not saying there is a lack of a framework. The framework is in the development, however, it is far from completion. They emphasize disclosure and financial signaling rather than what is important, real economy transformation. And real economy transformation, that is not being emphasized. You don't have a proper integrated framework as of now, which conceptualizes sustainable finance as a capital governance regime. Now, let me walk you through my methodology. So, I went for my search and identification through, Emerald Insights, Neon Giri, Google Scholar, etc. across 5 thematic areas, that is sustainable finance for like circular economy, sustainable mining, and net zero. I took the period of 2020 to 2026, like this is a more upcoming and evolving topic, so I chose this period. I identified about 247 papers. After that, I went for a thorough, proper analysis of screening and selection. I made sure that the papers were thematically relevant, they had a proper analytical depth. I removed quite a bit of duplicates and went for only English language papers, where I was able to retain about 95. And then I went for a thematic synthesis. I clustered my paper into 4 analytical clusters, which I will be explaining later on. So I made sure they are theoretically integrated. Now, let me walk you through the 4 integrated blocks that I've covered in my paper. You have regulatory and institutional architecture, like disclosure regimes, taxonomies, regulatory designs, etc. Next one is portfolio alignment and financial transmission. You talk about finance emissions metrics, net zero portfolio strategies, and etc. You go for circular economy finance and critical mineral governance, like material constraints, sustainable mining, circular finance instruments, which I've covered in this block. Compared to these 3, I also covered the more evolving block, which is AI and fintech, which is a rapidly evolving industry. So AI-driven ESG analytics and fintech green platforms, etc. So these are my 4 interrelated analytical blocks of my paper. What is this? So my 4 analytical blocks, I have deduced 3 structural tensions across these blocks. When you talk about regulation, you always have, again, the same as sustainable finance. You have a framework which is in the development, but it is far from not being fragmented. So your constraints in your institutional architecture of sustainable finances, you have limited supervisory capacity and there is a bit of fragmentation which is there. So that comes under a temporal tension. In your portfolio alignment, there is a lot of divergence in measuring where do you want to invest, whether it is renewable assets or non-renewable assets. That measurement divergence exists. Also, there is short-termism. That is, predominantly people are there unwilling to take risks in the long term. So they go for a short-term portfolio alignment. So this is a case of both a temporal and a governance constraint. In terms of circular economy, this is a completely material constraint because this is to mineral volatility, resource volatility in economies. There is a extraction governance issues as well. When it comes to digitization and fintech, which is the most evolving part, there is an algorithmic bias. That is, the system, it reproduces existing biases in governance and data, and that's a regulatory lag. That is, the regulatory supervision is unable to keep up with the level of automation in this field, which is a completely governance tension. So, I'll just go through what I mean by temporal, material and governance tensions. My argument here is sustainable finance should be understood as a capital governance regime rather than just a structural compliance element, right? So when I talk about my temporal tension, the gap between reporting and transformation is a big issue. Industries in their reporting and transparency are unable to keep up with the actual accountability and transformation in their sustainable finance. Material tension, there's a big discrepancy between the demand, supply and the maintenance of transparency in the mining industry. We talked about the paradoxical pressure. When you talk about decarbonization, when you take nickel or rare earth, which is moving away, it requires far more resources and energy for its extraction, right? So finance should operate within the extraction limits rather than outside it. When you talk about governance tension, as I said, in terms of AI and fintech, the governance capacity it's not up to the mark when it comes to the digital automation. That is, the level of updation and dynamical nature of the digitization, it is far exceeding the supervisory capacity, which creates plenty of constraints. Now, let me come to my findings, that is the key insights. When it comes to regulatory and institutional architecture, where I talked about the taxonomies and everything, just the proper disclosure or the proper compliance does not equate to a reduction in emissions. Because the wrong assumption is that just procedural compliance is a substitute for real economy operation change, which is not exactly true. It is paradoxical. There should be a proper definition, verification and enforcement of regulations in the first place, and there should be a proper understanding that regulatory compliance alone is not an equivalent for a reduction in an emission, right? Now, when it comes to portfolio alignment, you may ask me, how does portfolio decarbonization actually have an impact on your sustainable finance? Let's say, for example, you have a garbage can on your street, yeah? It is overflowing. What you do is you shift your can to the next street. Your street is clean, but is your neighborhood clean? No. That garbage can was from your street, you moved it to the other street. Your street is clean, but you have not eradicated the problem in itself. That is your portfolio transmission. One company may invest in coal or it may invest in non-renewable resources. It may sell its non-renewable assets to another entity. That does not eradicate the problem. The ownership alone of the problem has been transferred. So that is my key finding from my portfolio alignment. So there is also the risk of greenwashing, fraudulent claims of sustainability, which is very prevalent in this scenario. Circular economy in critical minerals. As I said, when you talk about cobalt, nickel or copper, which are much more renewable, even their extraction is much more heavier than current limits. In your circular economy, so green bonds will align your asset level investment with your portfolio level commitments. That is, from short termism, your sustainable finance investments will move to the long term, right? Developing economies require a proper institutional capacity due to various regulatory and resource constraints. In sustainable mining governance, we don't have to talk about how capital intensive or long-lived or expensive the mining assets are. But with sustainable finance, you can incentivize the electrification, waste reduction and environmental monitoring. Make it more renewable and sustainable. Governance, quality and innovation have to be proper determinants of your sustainable mining and mineral outcomes. Now, digitization. So I gave a separate doc for this because this is the most evolving factor. AI augments, so with AI augments, fintech platforms and blockchains, you can predict, increase the accessibility and you can reduce information asymmetry. That is what the merits that fintech and AI gives. However, you have algorithmic bias, that is, the system just reiterates all the biases in data and asymmetries which has already been provided. There is a lack of connection between how capable organizations are to supervise, along with how rapidly evolving the technological automations are. So digital interconnectedness, of course, it creates risk of cyber security. And when you decentralize the concept of sustainable finance as it is now, there is a very complicated regulatory oversight, right? So my takeaway is digitization is a proper catalyst that accelerates sustainable finance, but it cannot be a substitute for institutional compliance. From disclosure paradigm to capital governance, what is the current state to what is my target state? This is the core idea of my paper. What transition is required? So you have institutional proliferation, right? Where it is a disclosure heavy governance structure. That has to go to a capital governance structure which links financial flows directly to sectoral decarbonization outcomes. So from just being a proper disclosure that okay, we are a sustainable, we follow sustainable finance, or we are a sustainable organization, from that the governance should go to a proper capital allocation and energy allocation. Portfolio compliance is not equal to the production system change. It should rather be an integration of industrial policy with its finance for the high transition risk sectors. There should be a proper interconnected unit in terms of fiscal, monetary and supervisory elements. The real economy verification, right? When you have an integrated sustainable finance network, there is an interconnected system which closes the gap between commitments and structural transformation. Now, what are the various implications for policy institutions and future research? Regulatory reform. You have an integrated taxonomy which harmonizes disclosure along with proper capital reallocation. You have a proper portfolio and market design where, as I said, you are not transferring the ownership of the issue from one entity to another. You are distributing it, allocating it, and you are integrating it into your day-to-day development. Industrial and mineral policy. For an underdeveloped economy or for a developing economy, there should be proper credit guarantees which are given so that they too have the rights and the proper resources to conduct sustainable finance. There should be an alignment between mining finance and long-term decarbonization to ensure the sustainable development. Right? So I would like to conclude my presentation saying I mentioned it here as a foundation test. Sustainable finance is not just a foundational test. It should be looked as a perspective to whether capital governance can be restructured and can be bloomed, rather than looking at it as just a mere disclosure obligation. So it should go beyond instruments. So it's not just a bond or a green bond or something. Sustainable finance should evolve beyond instruments. It should not just be a reporting compliance. There are temporal, material and governance tensions which actually define the legitimacy challenge which have to be addressed. The choice ahead is it has to mature either into a genuine capital governance structure which can change the perspective and come out of its ecological constraints, or it will either remain a disclosure centric mechanism. So these are the two ways that sustainable finance has. So that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priya.